Thank you, Ali, and thanks to the organizers. The title of my talk is What is a Simulation of a Game? This talk is really motivated by my noticing over time lots of commentary, lots of discussion about both simulations and games, not only in game studies, but in other fields as well, without any sort of, at least from my point of view, and I think the consensus would be, any sort of definitive consequence to that discussion. That is, it's still controversial in several respects, both what a game is and what a simulation is, and equally the relationship between the two. Normally, the way we try to resolve that controversy is to define these two things, to define a simulation, define a game, and then compare to see if there's any similarities or differences. Defining things in general is on the wane. I think it will come back, but currently definitions are a little out of fad maybe. And so I was thinking maybe there was some other way to go about resolving this issue. I think it's an important issue, particularly when we're talking about what sort of meanings games have. So if games have some sort of relationship to simulations, then we can at least borrow in part some of our intuition and some of our understanding about what sort of meaning simulations have and apply that to games. So I'm going to do something a little different, I think, here than the normal process. And that's to assume, to really just talk about the relationship, not to talk about games or simulations in isolation of one another, but to talk about the relationship between the two. That has some advantages, it also has some disadvantages, but I'll go through those with you as I move through the talk. So do this with me, just assume one of these three things is true. Games are either not simulations at all, games are equivalent to simulations, or games occupy some other relationship. If we can start with those three, which I hope there won't be too much argument about, then what I propose to do is to examine each one of these three possibilities as to the consequences that possibility has on what would be a simulation of a game. For instance, could a simulation of a game even exist if one or another of these was true or wasn't true? So that's a kind of hypothesis I'm starting with, and I just want to kind of work through these possibilities, given this constraint that I've set for myself to try to define games and simulations only in terms of the other, only in terms of their relationship with the other. Now, as a first step, I sort of have to define what a simulation is a little bit, but again, I want to try to define that in terms of what relationship a simulation has to that which it simulates. So let me start with that. Here are the advantages I just mentioned. Let's see if I left anything out. I think I said that. So I've got to this point down here at the bottom now. I want to begin to try to talk about what sort of relationship a simulation has with anything, with X, not just with the game, but with anything at all. And it's a sort of reference, and it's a particular sort of reference. It's a reference that resembles its referent. And it resembles its referent in a way that's similar to what we normally call an icon, but I think it's also a little different. So what I've got up here is this sort of resemblance scale at the top, and on the left-hand side are references that don't have any resemblance to their referent. Commonly we call these symbolic references. And then you can move from left to right up here and become more and more, closer and closer, have a closer and closer sort of resemblance to the referent. At some point, you know, the talk the other day talked about simulations as having, I think the phrase used was non-trivial isomorphic relationship with its reference, something like that. And the key there is non-trivial. When does that resemblance become non-trivial? At some point it does. One of the advantages of this sort of analysis is I don't have to know exactly when that occurs. I just need to say, well, non-iconic references are different from iconic references because iconic references resemble their referent more. Now, I don't think that's too controversial, but as you can see here, I have something called a simulative reference that's a little different. It's sort of a subset, I would assert, I would claim, to this iconic reference category. And it has two differences. One is that it's a little more along the resemblance scale. That is, the resemblance we associate with a simulation of something is greater, is closer to the referent than the resemblance we allow for an icon. That's one claim I would make. Sometimes we talk about that sort of different or higher quality resemblance as being more dynamic, or use other kinds of characteristics or adjectives to describe it, but I don't want to get into that. That would be defining a simulation to a degree I don't want to try to do here. So I'm just going to say for the first claim is that a simulative reference resembles its referent more, I don't know if it's a lot or a little, but more than an iconic reference. And the second claim I want to make is this one, that an iconic reference can be equivalent to the thing itself. So that I am an icon of myself. I am both myself and I am a reference to myself. That's okay. I'm willing to live with that. However, I'm not willing to say I'm a simulation of myself. So this other little difference between a simulative reference and an iconic reference is that the simulative reference has a sort of otherness about it. It's not a clone of its reference. Now, those are very general claims. I hope they're not too controversial. This second one may be more controversial than the first, but there are some important sort of consequences or implications of those two. One is that we can build a simulation in two different ways. We can start with this mass of clay that has no resemblance to anything at all, and we can shape it somehow so that it becomes more and more similar to its referent. At some point along that shaping process, we get to a simulation. That's one way to do it. That's the normal way to do it, in fact, because we don't really know too much about the thing itself in most cases, so we're building a simulation in order to understand that thing better. So we kind of build, we get a little closer, and we figure out what's different and what's the same. So that's normally the way we go about it. But there's a second way to go about it too, based on the claims I've made so far, and that's to start with the thing itself and take something away. Take a little bit of something away, and you no longer have a clone, you have a simulation. So it seems to me these are both equally plausible ways to create a simulation. And I really wanted to focus on this one because it does allow us to say that a simulation is something other than that which it simulates, which is going to be important. We do have another word, by the way, for something that's the same or attempts to be the same as what we're trying to simulate. We call it an emulation normally. So we do have these two different words that point out, I think, the difference I'm drawing here. All right. So what I'm talking about is a simulation, which is a simulative reference. Here's an important consequence of the claims I've just made. If all that is true, if a simulation is a simulative reference, and if a simulative reference is something other than that which it simulates, then a simulation of a simulation is a simulative reference. It's other than a simulative reference. It's a paradox. So there is this kind of interesting consequence here that we can say a simulation of a simulation based on the claims I've made so far is not defined. It's a paradox. All right, so we're just setting everything up now to go back to this notion. Here are the three possibilities. Games are not simulative references. Games are, or there's something else. Has to be one of those three, I would claim. So if that relationship between games and simulations is number one, what do we mean by a simulation of a game? If that relationship is number two, what do we mean by a simulation of a game? And so forth. That's what I'm sort of working through here. All right, here's a first pass on this, just based on what we've talked about so far. Simulation of a game is, if games are not simulations, then a simulation of a game is something other than a game, right? Simulation is something other than its referent. So a simulation of a game is not game, it's not a game. If a simulation of a game, number two, if a game is a simulation, then a simulation of a game is a simulation of a simulation. We've got a paradox. Number three, the possibilities are much broader, so we've got, I say, just something other than those two things. So are simulations of games not games? Are they paradoxes? Sort of what I wanted to look at, and here's a test case. Suppose we took this procedure I described earlier. We take a game, let's take Doom, and we take away a little something from it. We subtract something from it. We create a simulation. The original Doom was 8-bit, 256 color. Suppose we make it a 2-bit grayscale version of Doom. According to the process I've described so far, we've got a simulation of Doom. Okay. Now, caveat already. Now, the simulation of Doom is a simulation of a specific game. Notice that. So it's not a simulation of games in general. It's a simulation of Doom. That's an issue. It's going to be an issue here. It sort of restricts how far I can go with this. And you'll see there the identity of a specific game may be determined by specific characteristics. What would be more interesting, I think, is if we were able to construct a simulation of a game more generally. But if we did that, then that throws, what is the definition of a game more generally? I said I wasn't going to deal with that, so I'm just stuck, for the moment at least, dealing with these three possibilities. So, if we take the simulation of Doom that I've just constructed here, and in scenario one, number one is games are not simulations, or a simulation of a game is something other than a game. Well, grayscale Doom would be a game. I think our intuition would say, well, that simulation of a game is still a game. So that sort of throws this scenario into question. It's not a very compelling scenario because the simulation of a game we've created, the grayscale Doom, is still a game. And if indeed that's true, if a simulation of a game, that would be grayscale Doom, is a game, then a game is something other than a game. That is, the simulation of a game in here, in the brackets, would have to be something other than a game to get us back to game. So we've got this weird paradox thing going on. I don't know if this has been too useful so far. So let's try scenario number two. Games are simulations. If a game is a simulation, the simulation of a game is a simulation of a simulation, or a paradox. Grayscale Doom is not a paradox. So once again, we have this issue where we can sort of move through this analysis and reach a paradoxical conclusion, but that again isn't very compelling for us to adopt this scenario number two, that games are simulations. So if we go to this, here's the possibility. Many possibilities, but remember, again, I'm trying to define or talk about the relationship between games and simulations only in terms of the other one. Sort of, instead of using the word to define the word, I'm trying to use simulation to define game and the word game to define simulation. So if a simulation is a simulative reference, and a simulative reference references something other than itself, then perhaps a game is a simulation that references itself. That would be sort of a weird simulation. It would be both a simulation and not a simulation at the same time, in a sense, sort of a paradox in a way. Now, are games paradoxes? Several people have made this claim. Kolnoy has made it. His claim was based on the simultaneous presence of cooperation and competition in games. Others, I would say most game studies or game studies related theorists don't make this claim, have some reason why competition and collaboration exist simultaneously, but not in a paradoxical form. The most available and probably widely known version of this explanation is Bernard Suits. His version says that illusory attitude is critical to gameplay, and in the grip of illusory attitude, game players overcome this paradox, resolve this paradox within that attitude. But the claim has been made, it's not original with me, that games indeed are paradoxical. Now, this is sort of an interesting, speculative, but interesting sort of consequence of this analysis, that games are, because remember, in the beginning I said, well, there's a lot of speculation pre-existing as to what the relationship between games and simulations are. There are different versions of that. Some would have games be a subset of simulations. Some would have simulations be a subset of games. Some would have them be the same thing, essentially, and so forth. But there's these different points of view. So one way perhaps to resolve this is to think of it in this way, as a game of sort of a unique simulation, or a simulation that breaks the rules of simulations. So rather than pointing to something other than itself, the game points only to itself. So it sort of simulates itself in a way that would make it paradoxical, but we have some, again, precedent for that sort of interpretation of games. So this is the speculative part. Suppose we go back to this task I constrained myself against, or I prohibited myself from pursuing earlier, and talk about creating a simulation of a game more generally, given the speculation that the game is a sort of a simulation of a simulation. So what would we take away from it? To create a simulation of a game, according to Suits and others, we might, speculatively, take away its illusory nature. What would a simulation of a game look like then? It would be not illusory. It would be something we would play, but we would not play with a illusory attitude, perhaps. It would be not a paradox. If the original game is paradoxical, this simulation of game is going to be non-paradoxical, and it would not be a game. So we might have a way here of distinguishing between what is a game and what is not a game, which is a question that many people don't have a great fondness for, I realize, but it still seems significant in my mind to this task of trying to determine what games mean, and if games mean the same things as, or the same sort of things in the same sort of way that simulations mean things. So here's my conclusion. Based on these three scenarios and the analysis I've presented here, I would conclude that number 3, this something other, is the most likely and compelling. The specifics of that I'm not able to determine with this analysis, but I think I am able to be somewhat persuasive in saying that since scenarios 1 and 2 are less likely, less compelling. So if games are neither simulations nor simulations, if games are either neither of those first two, then we do have this third scenario where we have to include some sort of paradoxical interpretation, and we have one available, some available to us from previous Kolnoy and others theorists in this context. That's it, I think.
Thank you, David. Questions? There's 1, 2. Okay, we start with Stefano and then go to John Rickard.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the sort of limits that you pose to your own thinking. So isn't it the case that you reach those paradoxical states chiefly by having defined a simulation as something other than the game, of course, in that resemblance situation? So my question here is like, where would you get, or would you get a better or perhaps more encompassing solution? Calling a simulation something different than a game, because calling it other, in the second passage, you get into a tertium non datur situation.
I think I have that possibility, don't I? So, let's go back here. Would number one be what you're talking about? Games are not simulations, so games are something other than simulations? Is that?
Oh, no, my question was simply directed to the idea that you started essentially your thinking by defining a simulation as something that has a referential relationship, but is other than. So the use of other means that at the second passage, you reach an impossibility.
Yes.
If you start different, you might not be in a paradoxical situation.
No, I think my conclusions follow from my assumptions. You're questioning my assumptions. My assumptions may be wrong. And I did say that I believe that my claim that simulations are necessarily something other than which they refer to is a controversial one. I think it's a defensible one as well, but I take your point.
Maybe next paper, different, then we'll see what happens.
Well, maybe. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is something you already addressed, but just a thought. Would it be helpful if you thought about what makes a game a game? It's not has nothing to do with reference or representation at all. Because the very simple suggestion would be that we are talking about properties which are not representational. I'm thinking you can have a chair, for example, it's yellow, but its yellowness does not represent the fact that it is yellow, something like that. And likewise, the fact that you have a note of money, it has a value, and that is a property. It's not a representation of something else. And likewise, perhaps with games, there are obviously a huge amount of reference and representations going on in games, but it is not what makes them.
I agree with you, and I take your point there too. I obviously, this presentation assumes that games are references. I would justify that position based on previous analysis of the relationship between simulations and games. So I began talking about how there is this controversial sort of relationship between simulations and games, but most people believe there is some relationship there. So on the basis of that consensus belief, and on the basis that simulations are references, I feel justified in saying perhaps games are references.
Hi, David. Thanks for this talk. I have one comment and maybe one question. Aren't simulations always already paradoxical because they are representations? That means they always simulate or can always be taken as simulating in some respect, and in others they don't. So a simulation is in a way always a simulation, not a simulation at the same time. That is...
Yes, but I don't think simulations are paradoxical. A simulation of a dog, a robotic dog, is not a paradox, is it?
But a simulation, since it is not the same as what it simulates, it has to be a little bit something else. So in that regard, that it is something else, it might also not simulate some parts of that what it simulates because it is not the same.
Yeah, that's the claim I'm making, that simulations necessarily are something other than that which they refer to or simulate. But I think only in the specific case where you have a simulation of a simulation. Mm-hmm. That's the paradoxical state I was referring to.
That is the second thing that I wanted to suggest. I've once tried to think that, because I was thinking about metaphor in games, and I was thinking about when does and particularly about the paradox between metaphor and simulation in game studies, and I was wondering what is a simulation and when does a game become a metaphor? And my idea was to take, you can take Tetris as a simulation for work, whatever, because it works like that, and that would be a first denotation of the game, and if that is established, and do you then use the game to simulate something else, it might become sort of a metaphor. And I'm thinking you could probably use Tetris to simulate the marriage in some respect.
or Humble's game, The Marriage, right?
Yeah.
I know I'm familiar with your analysis, and I'm appreciative of it. However, I would have to disagree that Tetris is a reasonable simulation of work. That is, I think there has to be some level of, some barrier of resistance, of resemblance that you have to move through in order to get to a simulation. Now, what that point is arguable, but it has to be non-trivial. Now, what's trivial and what's not? And according to my analysis, if Tetris was a simulation of work, first it would have to be an iconic reference to work. And then you would have to get a little closer to work to turn it into a simulation of work.
But don't you think that this approach to iconic already puts you on the level of the visual in the first place, and that is probably limiting a little bit in which way it can be iconic?
Well, not according to this, but possibly, yes.
I'm basically here on Sebastian's side, or could try to follow up on his. I was also thinking about, or asking myself, why do you completely bracket out the indexical quality that a simulation has to that which it simulates? But another question, and the more pertinent question to me, is when Sebastian mentioned Tetris, he said, okay, that doesn't really have that simulative connection to work. So my question would be, why are you trying to make the point that every game has to conform to that? So my question would be, if we don't take your theoretical example of the 2-bit Doom, but try your argument once with Tetris and once with FIFA 16, then we would get to very different, or not Tetris, but no Tetris, for example. No Tetris as a simulation of Tetris, and FIFA 16 as a simulation of football, of soccer. I think that would give us maybe very different results, and maybe contingent on what type of definition of game we imply.
But in my mind, as you're describing this, it would give very similar results, I think. We might try Tetris with, how many blocks are there? 6 in different blocks in Tetris? We'd take one of those blocks away, and we don't have the square, or we don't have the L shape.
Do you know Tetris? Because it's a version of Tetris that doesn't jump to a grid, so you have free rotation ability, and that basically, so you have something more, or unless you could argue that it's...
Something more is an interesting argument, which I haven't dealt with, but let's limit it to something less at the moment. You would have something less than Tetris, which I think would be a simulation, according to this, of Tetris. Now, the more you took away, you're going to slide down the scale here. You might have a reference to Tetris at some point, but you'll no longer have a simulation of Tetris. That would be the way I would approach that. The more issue is an interesting one, though.
I guess I wanted to ask, let me give you what seems to me a fairly clear set of relations, and tell me what's paradoxical about it, because maybe I missed your point.
Okay.
But the whole thing seems fairly a prioristic to me, and I guess I'm inclined to make a sort of a later Wittgensteinian response. Well, let's see how these terms are actually
You have to
used.
take a drink every time Wittgenstein is mentioned. I think that would help this conversation.
That's not really my orientation, so you won't. I won't help with the drinking cause much.
Well, I helped once.
Maybe that's all you need. But in any event, I mean, take a game of chess, right? Take a game of computer chess, and take, let's say, a notation that someone takes down of the moves in chess by watching the computer game, right? Somebody
Okay.
play a computer game. Now, what's paradoxical there? I'm inclined to say that chess is what it is. I mean, it's a game, and I don't see anything particularly paradoxical about it. You know,
Okay.
on the status
Well,
of this.
in fact, Kolnoy refers to chess in his example. So he talks about competition and collaboration existing simultaneously.
But I'm trying to take something, and so you have the computer chess, and that is a simulation in a sense of an actual board game of chess. But in a sense, it's also its own kind of game because you can play it as a game. Now, it may be hard. It may take Hegel or somebody. Do you have to take a drink with Hegel too? I mean, it may take Hegel or somebody to figure out the identity and difference relations there. But then my notation of a game of computer chess that somebody played, that would be a simulation of a simulation. If you want to call computer chess a simulation of the board game chess?
If your three examples, you're claiming something is taken away each time?
I'm just saying, as people usually discuss something and using chess as an example, I don't see anything paradoxical about any of that.
Oh, well, Kolnoy would disagree with you. I might disagree with you. There seems to be, I think, a more basic or fundamental level of paradox other than Kolnoy. Kolnoy specifically mentions collaboration and competition. Mine would be being yourself and not being yourself at the same time. Is putting yourself into some sort of Victor Turner liminal state. That's the paradoxical aspect of games and gameplay, and what I think is so unique about games, what makes them different from other things, and why it's so important to retain that difference, even to protect that difference. Because that particular experience, this liminal, illusory attitude, is the way Suits describes it, that aspect of games is its paradoxical component. Now, Kolnoy refers to it in a different way. I would refer to it in a, I think, a more fundamental way. But that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of when I think of games as paradoxical.
Right, but that's plenty of paradoxes there, and I agree with you on that. But in terms of just the general usage of simulation and that kind of thing, in terms of particular examples and the way it occurs in the literature, I just don't see the paradox. There's lots of it if you want to bring in the subjectivity of the player and the whole social situation they're working in, but the semantics of simulation whatevers.
Well, yes, Suits sort of answered this in his reply to Wittgenstein. I see if I can remember the quote. He said, he didn't know he would have to address how people use the term game. He thought he was going to be able to address what games really were.
Since Sebastian is the chair of this conference program committee, I'm inclined to give him one more tiny comment before we take for lunch break.
It's a very tiny comment. It is if you come from semiotics, and if you do that with semiotics, I think what is often forgotten is that a simulation is iconic, indexical, and symbolic. All these three things have to be there. And the symbolical means that there has to be somebody who acknowledges something to be a simulation of something. And that is quite important, I think.
Well, I think, yeah, this sort of goes beyond the paper, I think, but my interpretation of this is games evoke this experience, and they evoke it through a fairly objective set of properties. That is, the properties are objective, but the evocation, what makes those properties important or essential or fundamental, is their ability their capacity to evoke this liminal state in the player. So, yes, obviously the player is sort of the target or the consequence of the game, but the game itself, I think, has some properties we can address, we can talk about, that are different from the properties of other sorts of objects that do not evoke the same sort of liminal or illusory experience.
Okay. Thank you, David, for the presentation.